Well, hello everyone. Bonjour tout le monde again. Welcome to Why Create a Land Acknowledgement. Today, we have the opportunity to dive into local Indigenous histories, learn about land acknowledgements, and how to situate your personal responsibility as someone who lives on Indigenous land. We will walk through the concepts of recognition, action, practical steps on how to write and give an acknowledgement. Plus, you will leave today with a guide to support you and your foundation on how to write an authentic land acknowledgement. For those of you I have not met, my name is Tracy Babrick, Director of Learning and Network Engagement with Community Foundations of Canada, and I am absolutely honored to welcome you to today's session. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Just a quick friendly Zoom meeting reminder, you can see and hear us and we can see and hear you. So if you have not done so, please ensure to place yourself on mute during our conversation time today. We look forward to sharing open space during our call today when we go into breakout rooms, etc. And you'll have that opportunity to ask questions and also interact with Sam, our presenter today. We are set to gather for 80 minutes. I'm coming to you from Calgary, Alberta, Treaty 7 territory on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and Métis Nation. I am grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 7, and I'm continuing to learn more about how I can be a better friend to the Indigenous communities. I'm on a personal journey of building my knowledge and strengthening my respect, and come with an openness to learn and understand the truth. I am committed to honor the past, be aware of the present, and build an inclusive and caring future of peace, friendship, and understanding. Again, welcome. And before we get started, I'll just go through a couple more items in regards to today's event. We do have the availability to offer this session in both English and French today. So to access the French and English interpretation, you'll see a globe at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that screen, that globe, you can switch between the French and the English. We'll also be sharing a copy of the French slides in the chat. This session is being recorded and will be provided to you in a follow-up email. Now, I'm excited to introduce to you Samantha Matters, who is a founding director of Future Ancestors. Future Ancestors is an Indigenous and Black-owned youth-led professional services, social enterprise that advances climate justice and equity with a lens of ancestral accountability. Samantha is an accomplished academic. Boy, I'm having troubles today. I apologize. I'll pause for a moment, hold space for a second, and restart. Samantha is an accomplished academic published Indigenous researcher and foresight strategist. Sam is a Métis woman with mixed settler identity. On her Métis side, Sam is the Ross Collins, Grant and Olette families who have roots in the Meadow Lake region of Saskatchewan. Her settler family came to what is currently known as Alberta from Scotland and England 3 generations ago. She is, as mentioned, one of the founding directors of the Future Ancestors Services and a Next Generation Foresight Practitioner Fellow. Drawing on her expertise from both the public and nonprofit sector, Sam's future work explores possible futures through the lens of Indigenous, futism, ancestry, and equality and equity. We have been privileged to work with Sam for the All-In CFC conference that was held in 2021, where she provided guidance on land acknowledgements and also led an interactive session with community foundations on envisioning 7 generations into the future. I have found the time I've spent with Sam to be thought-provoking, grounding, and helps me pause to reflect on how I work on my own learning journey. Thank you, Samantha, for taking the time to share your knowledge with us today. And I'm absolutely humbled and honored to be able to pass the screen over to you. Welcome.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tracy, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you all for joining our session today. I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you all and diving into our subject today, which is really all about understanding and writing land acknowledgements. So we'll spend some time today thinking about, what is a land acknowledgement? Why do we care about it? Why might we want to think about crafting our own land acknowledgement? And we'll also get to spend some time practicing and actually, getting into the nitty-gritty of writing a land acknowledgement. So my hope for today is that you leave this session feeling well equipped to start to do your own research, start to do your own critical self-reflections, and begin the process of writing a land acknowledgement, whether that's for something specific, maybe an event you have coming up, or for something more open and to kind of have with you as you can continue to build practices around critical self-reflection. So I won't spend too much time here introducing myself. Thanks to Tracy for that great introduction again. But I will introduce myself in my language, which I am actively working on reclaiming, Michif. So Tanshe, Samantha Matters, Dishinakashon, Métis, Niayen, PM Eskuchi, Waskagan, Niwiken. Hello, everyone. I am Samantha Matters. I use she, her pronouns. I carry both Métis and mixed settler ancestry, and I'm joining you from Amesquitchi Waskagan, which is the Cree name for Edmonton here on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional Métis homeland. So this territory is where I'm from. This is where I was born. This is where I grew up. And this is where I continue to come back to today. Not specifically in Edmonton, a couple hours east of here, but on Treaty 6 territory, in the Parkland area, as we like to call it. And this is a place that really grounds me, really makes me feel connected to my identity, makes me feel connected to my ancestors, and really informs how I'm able to come into this work. So this relationship that I have with this territory is something that I require in order to do the work that we do at Future Ancestor Services. So to open the space today, I really want us all to start thinking about the land on which we find ourselves. And I would like to do that by sharing this quote from Stella Caban. And the quote here reads, "If you aren't immediately asking questions upon your arrival or your ancestors' arrival on the land that you are on, and about your role, history, and relationship to that land, then there needs to be some questions asked about how we perpetuate contemporary colonial erasure and violence." So I really like to open my spaces with this quote, regardless of the content that we're discussing, because it really asks us to pause and to do that reflection, to think about, where am I? How did I come to be on this land? What are my relationships with this land? And we talk about ancestry a lot at Future Ancestors, and we're going to talk about ancestry a lot today, because this really informs how we move through the world, thinking about who are our ancestors, how did their decisions, their actions, their inactions inform our lives today, inform the world around us, and what is our responsibility to our ancestors, recognizing that we ourselves will become ancestors one day. We are future ancestors, and our decisions and our choices will impact the generations that follow us. How are we accountable to those generations? So we're going to be spending a lot of time today, thinking about land acknowledgements, thinking about how we have come to find ourselves on the territories that we are on, thinking about perhaps how our ancestors found their way to these lands, thinking about where our ancestors are Indigenous to, and really importantly, thinking about our role, our history, and our relationship to that land. So understanding that, we are in relationship to the world around us. It influences us. We influence it. What does that relationship look like? And what do we want that relationship to look like? So I want to start off today with a poll for everyone that is joining us. So we're going to open up the poll, and the question is, have you ever given a land acknowledgement? So I'd invite you to take a couple moments to respond to this question. Of course, there's no wrong answer. And yeah, this will really help me kind of frame the content as we go forward. So we'll wait just a few moments for folks to respond to the poll, and then we'll see the results. So go ahead and do that. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. I see we have actually a pretty close split. So 56% of us have given a land acknowledgement, while 44% have not. So this is really cool. I think there are going to be lots of really good learnings today, including from each other. So let's dive into our content. And we're going to start off by thinking about what is a land acknowledgement? So I think this is, something that we've been hearing a lot about, especially over, the past 5 to 10 years. We've heard a lot about land acknowledgements. We've perhaps witnessed a lot of land acknowledgements. But I think it's really important to remember that these acknowledgements of territory are a way that we can begin to center indigeneity in our work, that we can begin to advance anti-racism efforts. And if we think about, where land acknowledgements come from, these are Indigenous teachings of various communities across what we currently know as Canada, in recognition of the land and that relationship. So often ceremonies are opened with an acknowledgement of the land and our ancestors. And by engaging in these practices, we're also engaging in those teachings. And, as we go, I'll talk about how we can do that in a respectful way, but it's really important to acknowledge that this is something that comes from Indigenous teachings, and we really need to take leadership from Indigenous peoples in terms of understanding what land acknowledgements are and how they might be delivered. So there are many reasons that we offer land acknowledgements, especially, for those of us who carry non-Indigenous identities. So we do this work to really acknowledge the original caregivers of the land we find ourselves on, and recognize that there were people on these lands before colonial contact. Recognize that this was home to many diverse communities and groups of people. So we're acknowledging those original caregivers. Land acknowledgements also help us acknowledge our own connection to the land and to the gifts that Mother Earth provides us, and to really remind ourselves that as humans, we are not the center of the universe. To remind ourselves that without this land, without Mother Earth, we could not exist here. We also do land acknowledgements to hold responsibility. So this is where we start to see that action piece come in with land acknowledgements, holding responsibility, being accountable as guests on this land, whether or not we were invited. So really acknowledging that, we didn't just arrive here as non-Indigenous people. There's a process that happened to, find ourselves on these territories, and that we are guests of the host nation. We are guests of the land herself. Land acknowledgements also really support us in recognizing contemporary realities for Indigenous peoples across Canada. So this is not just an acknowledgement of history or the past, but an acknowledgement of the current existence of Indigenous peoples, and the challenges that they face and the way in which they thrive on these lands. So again, acknowledging that this is not something that is just in reference to the past, but reminds us of contemporary realities today. And then finally, land acknowledgements can be really useful in prompting questions, just like those that we're discussing here today. Asking us to consider why we do land acknowledgements, asking us to consider how are the original caregivers of these lands treated within our society? How are their descendants treated within our society? And again, start to engage in a more critical way in understanding our relationship to the land, the way that we benefit from it, and in some cases, who no longer has access to these traditional territories. And really importantly, land acknowledgements combat the erasure of Indigenous peoples. So we're creating space within our institutions, within our organizations, within ourselves that help reclaim history, identity, and space for Indigenous peoples. Again, acknowledging that Indigenous peoples are not a thing of the past, that we are here today, and that these still remain our lands and our home, and we have responsibilities to these lands still today. So I'm often asked, especially when I'm coming to events, who should give a land acknowledgement? Or I myself am asked to deliver a land acknowledgement, even on territory that I am not from. And while it can be a gracious gesture to invite an Indigenous person to deliver a land acknowledgement, it should really be delivered by the organization themselves, by the host that's inviting people into this space. This is considered a sign of respect and effort, but it is also essential in understanding what a land acknowledgement is and what it is not. So we'll get into what it is and is not, but it's really important to acknowledge ourselves as hosts and acknowledge ourselves as guests on the land and recognize our own responsibility to making that acknowledgement, to articulating our relationship with the land and with the original caregivers of that place. So in this way, land acknowledgements are everyone's responsibility. And that's why we're here today, discussing how we can begin to understand land acknowledgements and also create them for ourselves from a really individualized place. So it is really important then that our land acknowledgements are contextually and individually specific. So, the land acknowledgement that you offer should be very unique to your own identity, to your own experiences, and to your own relationships. So this means then that we have to go through a process of reflecting on our ancestry and on that relationship to land. And this can be a really challenging practice because oftentimes we have to engage with some really uncomfortable truths about our own ancestry and how our ancestors came to be on these lands. And it's meant to be uncomfortable. This can often be challenging as well because a lot of us perhaps aren't used to thinking about land and the environment as something we're in relationship with. And this idea is fundamentally rooted in Indigenous worldviews that tell us that we're all connected, that we're all integrated with one another, that we are in relationship, not only with our family, our kin, our friends, but with every being, with every element of the natural world. So this is a practice that takes some time to build, but we can definitely work on these skills. So when it comes to localizing land acknowledgements to ourselves, to our own specific context and individuality, we want to start by reflecting on our ancestry. So when we're talking about our ancestors, this can embody both our direct ancestors as well as our collective ancestors. So our direct ancestors being those in our lineage, in our family tree, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, our great-grandparents, etc. We can map back our ancestries through our lineage. But we also share ancestry with a collective. So folks who share important elements of our identity, folks who have benefited from a relationship with the land in a similar way, folks who have been disadvantaged because of a particular relationship with the land. So this kind of collective ancestry, is really dependent on the identities that we carry and on our lived experiences, and how we're able to move through the world based on identity and based on lived experience. So we can also think about our collective ancestry as we're doing this reflection. And to support this reflection, I'm offering a couple of questions here for you to start to consider to build this practice. So when localizing land acknowledgements for ourselves, we can begin by asking, who are your ancestors? Do you know their names? Do you know where they're from? Who are they? What's your relationship with them? We can also ask ourselves, did our ancestors have relationships with the original peoples of what we currently call Canada? Was there an interaction between our ancestors and the original caregivers? Do you have a relationship with the original caregivers of the land you find yourself on? And really importantly, we can also ask ourselves, what is your relationship to the land you find yourself on? Do you have a relationship? How do you regard the land that you live, work, and play on? What does that relationship look like? What does it feel like? So I'm going to pause here for just a couple of minutes for you to start thinking about these questions. I encourage you to jot down some notes, maybe save these questions somewhere where you can come back to them continually. Just take a couple of moments, a couple of minutes here to really think about these questions and to start to do that reflection. I'd encourage you to use the chat if that's useful. Maybe consider jotting down some of your reflections and sharing them with the group, whatever feels good for you. Okay, as folks continue to reflect on these questions, I'll just respond to a few questions I see in the chat because I think that could be helpful for this work. So one question we have here is an example of collective ancestry. So for myself, I share ancestry with my Métis relatives, my Métis kin. I can map back through my lineage, my grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, etc., and so on. But I also share collective identity with many more Métis people than just that. And I share this identity through the shared struggle that our nation experienced on these lands. I share that identity through our connection and our teachings and our practices. So while we may not be directly related, I share ancestry through that collective experience. So, someone with settler identities like myself, I also can map back my grandparents, my great-great-grandparents on my settler side of the family, but I do share collective ancestry with others who came from Scotland and England and other places to find themselves on these lands. So those ancestors and their decisions and the way they interacted with the original caregivers, I also share ancestry with those folks as well. Another question I'm seeing here is not quite understanding your relationship to the land. So again, this is that really challenging practice to start to think about, how am I connected to the natural world? What does that look like for me? So for some people, a relationship to the land can feel very distant. The land is something that I imagine to be over there, that's very separate from me, that I'm able to gather resources from, to gather maybe joy through recreation from, but it's over there, it's separate. Other folks have a relationship to land that really is integrated and connected. So for me, I feel like my truest self when I am out on the land, when I can put my feet on the ground, when I can be amongst the trees. And I understand that this is a reciprocal relationship, that what I am able to gain from Mother Earth, I also have a responsibility to give back. And we do this through ceremony and offerings and gifts back to the land. So what your relationship looks like to the land will be very unique to you and your own worldview around how humans and the land are connected. And then finally, what if you just don't know? How do you find out? This is a really good question, especially regarding ancestry. I am a reconnecting Métis person, meaning I didn't grow up next to or nearby my Métis kin. I did not grow up with teachings, and connecting with those ancestors, connecting with those family members that exist today is something that is my responsibility and is my work to do. So, a lot of the time when we're thinking about our ancestors, we can think about, looking at genealogy and doing that work to map out our family trees. We can think about connecting with the relatives we do have access to learn the stories of our ancestors, how they came to be here, what their experiences were. So, we can do this in a couple different ways, through kind of research and genealogy, through connecting with folks and sharing stories and learning histories that way. So let's wrap up our self-reflection here. These questions will be available to you in the slides following the presentation. But I want to talk about another way in which we localize land acknowledgements. And that is by being very specific to the place that we find ourselves on. So part of land acknowledgements is really learning about the territory you're on, about the gifts that land has given you, and about the history of that place. So again, this is not meant to be a comfortable practice, because a lot of times this means we have to engage with histories that have been actively erased from Canadian education systems, and we have to come to terms with benefits that we have gained at the expense of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous livelihoods. So again, creating a land acknowledgement is not meant to be a comfortable thing. These are not meaningless words. We are doing the work to understand ourselves in relation to land, in relation to the original caregivers, and we're doing the work to understand the history of the place that we find ourselves on, and how we are able to benefit from that land because of that history. So I wanted to offer an example of one of these uncomfortable truths, one of these erased truths that we have to come to terms with when we're thinking about the land on which we find ourselves. And again, I'm based here in Amiskwichi, Waskagan in Edmonton, and the Papas Chase First Nation is a nation that has a long history with these lands, but we don't typically hear this nation referenced in land acknowledgements for this place, in the history of what we currently know as Edmonton. And that's because of this kind of complex history and also because of systemic erasure. So by the mid-1800s, Chief Papas Chase and his Cree band inhabited the Lesser Slave Lake region of Alberta. So this is a place a few hours north of what we currently know as Edmonton. But by 1877, the community members in this nation were forced to really redefine their way of life because of famine and disease in the Lesser Slave Lake region, and began to move further south. And the Papas Chase Cree settled in and outside of Fort Edmonton to improve these conditions, but also to increase their access to the Hudson's Bay Company as the fur trade began to come a way of ensuring Indigenous livelihood. So upon arriving in this place, upon settling in this place, Chief Papas Chase and his brother were actually both co-signatories of Treaty 6 at Fort Edmonton in 1876. And the signing of this federal document recognized the Papas Chase Cree as a First Nation. So we know that these brothers were included in the signing of Treaty 6. And part of this process of agreeing to and signing this treaty was that in exchange for the land that they were living and benefiting from and occupying, the Papas Chase Cree First Nation was supposed to receive reserve lands, rights, annual payments for those lands, tools, medicine. But what happened was while this nation was granted their reserve, government agents illegally reduced the reserve size and pushed them further from what is currently the city. So further south from the fort than the reserve was originally designated. So initially, Papas Chase Cree was entitled to 49.9 square miles in what is now downtown Edmonton. However, their reserve was reduced down to 40 square miles and located much farther south. And again, this happened illegally. This happened after the signing of the treaty, after these promises were made. And unfortunately, the Papas Chase First Nation was ultimately forced to move from their lands again as Edmonton began to grow and to expand. So not only was their reserve forcibly surrendered, they also lost their federal status as a First Nation. So the taking back of these reserve lands by the city, by federal agents, ultimately resulted in this nation losing their status, which has effects because this nation no longer has those rights that were initially promised upon the signing of Treaty 6. So this reserve, the removal happened for many reasons, one of which was to make room for this expanding city of Edmonton, to make room for a railway between Edmonton and Calgary. This reserve was deemed to be in the way, inhibiting the city's expansion. It was also deemed to be taking up valuable agricultural land for European settlement. And ultimately, this removal also granted access for the state to those natural resources that were on those reserve lands. So while Papa's Chase First Nation was a signatory to Treaty 6, they no longer have status as a First Nation due to these illegal activities executed by the state. And as a result of this forcible displacement from these lands, the Papa's Chase First Nation scattered and many members left to join other communities around Edmonton in order to survive. Edmonton itself continued to grow, and eventually people completely forgot this history. I'm sharing this map, this image here, to kind of show you where Edmonton was, kind of that white space in the center, where the reserve was a little bit further to the south. And this is very much within the city limits of Edmonton as we know them today. Mill Creek runs through what was the Papa's Chase Reserve. This is one of my favorite places to take my dog out walking. There's a golf course that now occupies this land, and very few people know the history of this land and what happened to the Papa's Chase First Nation illegally to have their status completely removed as a First Nation. So in the present, Chief and Council of the Papa's Chase First Nation continue to assert this history. Archaeologists continue to find evidence that these people had been living in the area for thousands of years, and work continues to regain status, but also to be acknowledged as the original caregivers of these lands. So we'll move into another round of self-reflection, and this time I'm asking you to consider, what territory are you on? What are the names of the place that you find yourself? You might know their colonial names. Do you know their Indigenous names? What do we call this place? Also ask yourself, who are the original caregivers of this territory? And what is their history on these lands? And then finally, how do you benefit from living and working on this territory? So while we might not be able to answer right now whose territory we find ourselves on, what its names are, this is going to be our work in the last portion of our session today. So I'm going to share some resources for how you can determine the territory you find yourself on. But this last question, I think we can all begin to engage with now. So how do you benefit from living and working on this territory? Consider that carefully. What benefits are you able to access? What privileges are you granted because you're able to reside on these territories? So again, I'd encourage you to start to jot some notes down. If you don't know the answers, jot that down as well so we can come back to it. Just take a few moments here and begin this process of self-reflection. Okay, take a couple of moments to wrap up your reflections. Again, these questions, I encourage you to save them somewhere where you can come back to them, acknowledging that this is continual work. These are not questions we can answer one time and call it a day. These are something that we should continue to come back to on a regular basis. So I want to kind of close out the content portion of our session by thinking about how we can start to shift the focus or shift our intentions regarding land acknowledgements, because these can become really common and really lacking intentionality. These can become, a nice to do thing, a bare minimum thing. They can become meaningless very easily. So ultimately, again, land acknowledgements are not meant to be empty words that we repeat at the beginning of every event to comfort those with settler identities by saying, we're doing something, we're doing a land acknowledgement, we're doing reconciliation. That is not what land acknowledgements are for. Land acknowledgements are intended to provide an opportunity for individuals to reflect on their identity, to reflect on their ancestry, on their relationship to land, and their responsibilities to the original caregivers of the territories on which they live, work, and play. So land acknowledgements should not be about this idea of tokenism, of thinking about who will teach me about this land and its original stewards. Rather, it asks us to name our own accountability. What is my role and responsibility to learning the history of this place? This is not labor that we're expecting Indigenous folks to offer us. This is our responsibility. Land acknowledgements should also not be about creating comfort. This is not about finding the path of least resistance, of avoiding hurt feelings. Land acknowledgements are about challenging what we think to be truth. It's about confronting your place on this land and acknowledging and encouraging others to do the same. And this is not a checkbox activity. This is not something that we should start off the top of a program or a meeting with, because this is what we deem to be reconciliation, and this is the bare minimum that we can do. Land acknowledgements ask us to engage in transformative acts, to ask ourselves, how can I disrupt and create discomfort in order to catalyze change? These are an opportunity for us to reimagine relationships with land, with original caregivers. It's an opportunity for us to really acknowledge our role in creating better futures for generations that will follow us. So ultimately, land acknowledgements should seek to disrupt and to unsettle those who speak and those who hear these words. The history of these lands is not meant to be comfortable. The history of these lands actively sought to erase Indigenous peoples. And that's something that we have to acknowledge and come to terms with when we're understanding how we're able to exist here today on these lands. I wanted to share this quote from Chelsea Vowell, a Métis scholar and author, that really captures these sentiments of what I'm trying to explain here. So Chelsea Vowell initially posted this on their blog in September of 2016, titled Beyond Territorial Acknowledgements. And I'm going to read this quote for you and encourage you to really sit with these words. If we think of territorial acknowledgements as sites of potential disruption, they can be transformative acts that to some extent undo Indigenous erasure. I believe this is true as long as these acknowledgements discomfort both those speaking and hearing the words. The fact of Indigenous presence should force non-Indigenous peoples to confront their own place on these lands. So again, as we begin crafting our land acknowledgements here today, how are we creating space for disruption? How are we creating space to step into discomfort? So to help us do this in a more practical way, I've created a set of guidelines for us when it comes to crafting our own land acknowledgement. I've kind of summarized the steps here for you, but I go into much more detail in the learning manual that will be shared following the presentation today and will be available as a resource on CFC's Learning Institute. So you'll have access to these manuals in both English and French. And the guidelines here are much more in depth. So when you get a chance, take a look through the manuals because I provide, some tips on how we can do this. I provide an example of how you might create a land acknowledgement, and in general go into a bit more detail around the content than what we were able to discuss today. But ultimately, what we're seeking to do here is to set aside time to really plan out and write a land acknowledgement, just as we would with any other speech or opening or welcoming. So taking the time to do this work. A really helpful way to approach writing your own localized land acknowledgement is to begin by finding what I like to call a generic land acknowledgement. So we can find these on, our city websites, on university pages. College pages are a really good place to go to find a generic land acknowledgement. And this can help us begin to identify the original caregivers of the land we find ourselves on. Nativeland.ca is also a really useful tool to help us do this. This takes a global approach to Indigenous territories. So you can find the territories of the land you find yourself on, but you can also find the Indigenous nations of perhaps the land your ancestors are from. So, if your ancestors arrived to Canada, regardless of when that happened, you can also take a look at the lands, the Indigenous nations of the lands of your ancestors' origins as well. And then finally, the last kind of step is to recreate that land acknowledgement that includes your own reflections on ancestry, on your relationship to land, and your responsibility. So again, all of this is available in much more detail in the learning manual. So I would encourage you to download those and save them when you're able. I see they were just linked in the chat. But for the rest of our time today, we're going to begin practicing writing our land acknowledgements, practicing doing the research necessary to create a land acknowledgement. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes in breakout rooms today, beginning to work on our land acknowledgement. So I'll kind of explain the process before we open the rooms. But what I'm going to ask everyone to do is to choose the breakout room that matches your geographic location. So you should have the option to choose which breakout room you want to go to. And we're doing this to support shared learning. So you'll be in a room with those who find themselves on territory that's the same as yours or close to yours. So you'll be able to do research collectively to inform the creation of your land acknowledgement. So first things first, choose your breakout room based on your location. Once you're in the breakout rooms, we're going to be considering these 4 questions. And I have provided them in the mural boards we'll be collaborating on as well. So we'll have the links to both the English and the French mural boards go out in the chat, and you can see all of these questions right on those boards for yourself. So in your breakout rooms, consider each of the questions. So the first being, who are the original caregivers of the lands on which you live, work, and play? Nativeland.ca is linked there for you to open up to do that work. Consider what further research you need to do to inform your land acknowledgement. And if you have any other resources that you find really valuable, share them here. We can jot down our responses to all of these questions on the sticky notes that are provided in the mural board. The next question is, how does your ancestry need to inform your relationship to the original caregivers? So again, what were your ancestors' inactions or actions related to original caregivers? How does that inform your responsibility? And then finally, what stood out to you today in the workshop? And again, I'd encourage you to grab these sticky notes, jot down your comments. This can become a shared resource for you to come back to as you continue the practice of building and writing your own land acknowledgement. So we're going to head into our breakout rooms, and we will come back from our rooms at 20 past the hour, where we'll be able to then go into a Q&A session and our closing. So mural board links are coming to you